आजको हाम्रो यो छलफल चाहिँ यो लामो यो चाडपर्व सम्बन्धी चाडपर्वको छुट्टी सुरु हुनुभन्दा अगाडिको अन्तिम छलफल हो। मार्टिन चौतारीले आइतबार र मङ्गलबार आयोजना गर्ने छलफलहरू चाहिँ यो आउने हप्ता र त्योभन्दा पछिको अर्को हप्ता आयोजना हुनेवाला छैन। अब एकैचोटि अक्टोबर 24मा छलफल हुनेछ, नेक्स्ट वान। त्यो चाहिँ दक्षिण एसियामा सामुदायिक रेडियो सम्बन्धी छलफल हुनेछ र त्यो छलफलका विवरणहरू चाहिँ केही दिनभित्र सार्वजनिक हुनेछ। यो अक्टोबर महिना र कार्तिक पनि आउन लाग्यो। यो चाहिँ एउटा महत्त्वपूर्ण मार्टिन चौतारीको छलफलको आयोजना सम्बन्धी पक्षमा चाहिँ एउटा महत्त्वपूर्ण माइलस्टोन हामी पार गर्न लागिरहेछौँ। अक्टोबर 1991 मा पहिलो छलफल सुरु भएको थियो, पछि जुन कालान्तरमा त्यसलाई मङ्गलबारे भनियो। अब अक्टोबर 2021 मा त्यसले 30 वर्षसम्म लगातार छलफलको श्रृङ्खला चलेको चाहिँ एउटा ठुलो माइलस्टोन चाहिँ पार हुँदैछ। त्यो पार गर्ने अवसरमा हामीले केही कार्यक्रमहरू आयोजना गर्नेछौँ, जसको विवरण चाहिँ हामी पछि सार्वजनिक गर्नेछौँ। आजलाई मैले यति भने। अब म आजको वक्ता डाक्टर विजयेन्द्र राव, जसलाई चाहिँ धेरैजसो साथीहरूले, उहाँका साथीहरूले चाहिँ बिजु राव भन्नुहुन्छ, उहाँको म छोटो पहिला अङ्ग्रेजीमा परिचय दिन्छु र अनि त्यसपछि म अलिकति लामो चाहिँ नेपालीमा परिचय दिन्छु। त्यसको कारण चाहिँ अब नेपालीमा सुन्दा सुन्दा उहाँलाई, बिजुजीलाई अलिकति झ्याउ पनि लाग्ला। पहिला म अङ्ग्रेजीमा बोल्छु। सो Biju, I am going to make a very short introduction of you in English and a longer introduction of you in Nepali, because I think you'll be quite used to hearing you being introduced in English. I thought we will engage in some novelty of introducing you in Nepali. I first met Biju 33 years ago, almost to the month. In the fall of 1988, I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania as a beginning level graduate student in the Department of Economics to start a PhD program. And Biju was a senior PhD student there. I had a miserable year and I eventually ran away from the department. Biju was almost finished with his PhD, and eventually he got the degree from Penn in 1990. He then worked in various capacities as a postdoc, also worked as an assistant professor of economics at Williams College in Western Massachusetts for some years before he joined the World Bank in 1999, according to his own bio available in his website. So he's been with the bank for over 23 years now, almost 23 years. Biju is an expert on many things related to the world, and especially the world of economic development. But I think I would characterize his work in two main ways. Although he has a PhD in economics, he is a practitioner, interdisciplinary practitioner, and has been so for almost all of his professional life. He has engaged very seriously with anthropologists, with historians, and with practitioners of sociology and political science, both in his research and in his everyday professional conversations for all these years. And that's quite evident in the way he's published his edited volumes, his own articles in different types of journals, including journals, economics journals, obviously, but also journals in political science and elsewhere. So he's an interdisciplinary practitioner who believes in mixed methods, and he'll probably talk a little bit about what the kind of mixed methods he's engaged in producing this book later on. But in terms of thematics, he's also very interested in issues related to deliberation, deliberative democracy, and issues related to voice and agency in very unequal societies like the kinds that we have in South Asia. So what is the place of deliberation in unequal society? This is a theme that is really been his professional focus for a very long time. So at least the last 20 plus years, he seems to have worked on themes around this for multiple publications that the World Bank itself has published. Currently, he's the lead economist in the development research group of the World Bank. मैले बिजुजीको छोटो परिचय अङ्ग्रेजीमा दिएँ। अब म नेपालीमा अलिकति लामो परिचय दिन्छु। मैले सर्वप्रथम चाहिँ उहाँलाई सेप्टेम्बर 1988 तिर युनिभर्सिटी अफ पेन्सिल्भेनियाको इकोनोमिक्स डिपार्टमेन्टको जब त्यहाँ मैले आफ्नो पिएचडी प्रोग्राम सुरु गरेँ त्यति बेला मैले सर्वप्रथम भेटेको हुँ। मलाई त त्यति याद भएन। त्यो वर्ष चाहिँ इकोनोमिक्सको पिएचडी विद्यार्थी भएर अलिकति मैले दुःख पाउँदाखेरि चाहिँ अलि झन्डै झन्डै रुँदै म उहाँको अफिसमा पुगेको थिएँ रे। त्यसको मलाई त्यति राम्रो सम्झना भएन, तर उहाँले मलाई केही वर्ष अगाडि नेपालमा आउनु हुँदाखेरि मलाई त्यो कुरा सम्झाउनु भएको थियो। बिजुजीले चाहिँ सन् 1990मा त्यो डिपार्टमेन्टबाट चाहिँ बर्थ, म्यारेज एन्ड डेथ, 3 essays in demographic economics essays के थियो टाइटल भन्ने शीर्षकमा चाहिँ 3टा एसे लेखेको पिएचडी गर्नुभएको थियो। 1990 को दशकमा उहाँले विभिन्न ठाउँमा पोस्ट डक्टरल रिसर्च पनि गर्नुभयो र विलियम्स कलेज जो चाहिँ अमेरिकाको धेरै जसोको दृष्टिकोणमा 1 नम्बरको लिबरल आर्ट्स कलेज हो, त्यो कलेजमा उहाँले केही वर्ष पढाउनु भयो र सन् 1979 मा भनेको 23 वर्ष अगाडि वर्ल्ड ब्याङ्क जोइन गर्नुभयो। उहाँ अहिले वर्ल्ड ब्याङ्कमा चाहिँ डेभलपमेन्ट रिसर्च ग्रुपको लिड इकोनोमिस्ट हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँका जर्नलमा उहाँले विभिन्न जर्नलहरूमा आफ्नो आर्टिकल्सहरू पब्लिस गर्नुभएको छ। यो इकोनोमिक्सका एकदम लिडिङ जर्नल्सहरू अमेरिकन इकोनोमिक रिभ्यू, युरोपियन इकोनोमिक रिभ्यू, जर्नल अफ डेभलपमेन्ट इकोनोमिक्स अथवा जर्नल अफ पोलिटिकल इकोनोमी लगायत अरू जर्नलहरूमा उहाँका लेखहरू प्रकाशित भएका छन्। तर अमेरिकन पोलिटिकल साइन्स रिभ्यूमा पनि उहाँको लेख प्रकाशित भएका छन्। इन टर्म्स अफ उहाँ अर्थशास्त्री भए तापनि अरू विधाका विशेष गरेर एन्थ्रोपोलोजी, सोसियोलोजी, पोलिटिकल साइन्स र हिस्ट्रीका विधाका अभ्यासकर्ताहरूसँग पनि उहाँको राम्रो यो रिसर्चकै दौरानमा र अरू प्रोफेसनल कामको दौरानमा उहाँको सहकार्य पहिलेदेखि नै चल्दै आएको हो। मार्टिन चौधरीको लाइब्रेरीमा चाहिँ उहाँले सम्पादन गर्नुभएका, सहसम्पादन गर्नुभएका 2टा किताबहरू छन्। कल्चर एन्ड पब्लिक एक्सन, यो सन् 2004 मा पब्लिस भएको किताब हो र यो चाहिँ अर्थशास्त्रीहरू र एन्थ्रोपोलोजिस्टहरू बीचको सहकार्य र संवादको लाई ढोका खोल्ने खालका किताब, ढोका खोल्ने एसेजहरू भएको किताब हो भने सन् 2012 मा हिस्ट्री, हिस्टोरियन्स एन्ड डेभलपमेन्ट पोलिसी भन्ने अरू डेभलपमेन्ट पोलिसीमा इतिहासकारहरूसँगको संवाद खोल्नलाई तयार गरेको अर्को किताब पनि उहाँले सहसम्पादन गर्नुभएको थियो। गएको 20 वर्षभन्दा बढी समय चाहिँ उहाँ चाहिँ यो इन्टरडिसिप्लिनरी प्र्याक्टिसनर्स र विशेष गरेर अनुसन्धानको क्रममा चाहिँ जसलाई मिक्स मेथड भन्ने गरिन्छ त्यसको चाहिँ अभ्यासकर्ता त हो नै, तर रिसर्चको ध्याउनाको दृष्टिकोणले चाहिँ दक्षिण एसियाका असमान मुलुकहरू जस्तो भारत, नेपाल लगायतका असमान मुलुकहरू जहाँ चाहिँ कास्ट र जेन्डरको बहुत असमानता छ, ती देशहरूमा चाहिँ सहभागितामूलक विकास भनेको के हो, अर्थात् पार्टिसिपेटरी अप्रोचेस टु डेभलपमेन्ट भनेको के हो। यस्तो देशहरूमा चाहिँ डेलिबरेटिभ डेमोक्रेसी अर्थात् संवादमा आधारित डेमोक्रेसी अथवा संवादमा आधारित प्रजातन्त्रता अथवा अहिलेको हामीले लोकतन्त्र जसलाई भन्छौँ त्यो भनेको के हो। मान्छेको एजेन्सी अथवा भोइस, जसलाई चाहिँ अब हामीले अहिले नेपालीमा भन्दाखेरि आवाज भन्दाखेरि त भोइसको ठ्याक्कै रूपान्तरण त होइन, तर बोल्न सक्ने क्षमता अर्थात् आफ्नो एजेन्सीलाई चाहिँ आर्टिकुलेट गर्न सक्ने क्षमताको बारेमा उहाँले धेरै लामो समयसम्म सोच्नु भएको छ र यसको बारेमा धेरै किसिमका सामग्रीहरू प्रकाशित गर्नुभएको छ। उहाँको वर्ल्ड ब्याङ्कले सन् 2012 मा निकालेको एउटा महत्त्वपूर्ण रिपोर्ट छ, त्यसलाई चाहिँ लोकलाइजिङ डेभलपमेन्ट डज पार्टिसिपेसन वर्क भन्ने खालको यो रिपोर्टलाई चाहिँ नोबेल प्राइज विजेताहरूले समेत पनि एकदमै महत्त्वपूर्ण रिपोर्ट भनेर भनिएको रहेछ। आजको उहाँको प्रस्तुति चाहिँ उहाँ र परमिता सन्यालजीले सहकार्य गरेर लेख्नु भएको र सन् 2018 मा केम्ब्रिज युनिभर्सिटी प्रेसले निकालेको ओरल डेमोक्रेसी डेलिबरेशन्स इन इन्डियन भिलेज असेम्ब्लिज भन्ने किताबमा आधारित आजको चाहिँ उहाँको प्रस्तुति र छलफल हुनेछ। यो नेपालको सन्दर्भमा पनि महत्त्वपूर्ण लागेर उहाँलाई हामीले चाहिँ यसबारे बोलिदिनुहोस् भनेर अनुरोध गरेका हौँ। आज दुर्भाग्यवश चाहिँ धेरैजनाको यहाँ पार्टिसिपेसन, आज हाम्रो छलफल चाहिँ पार्टिसिपेसनको बारेमा भए तापनि यहाँ छलफलमा चाहिँ धेरै पार्टिसिपेन्टहरू देखिँदैन। So with apologies to Biju for the small number of participants, I would now like to request him to start his initial presentation, which might last for up to 45 minutes. त्यसपछि थोरै समूह भएको हुनाले we will then have the chance to talk to him rather, in a close small group. Biju, welcome and please start.
Thank you, Pratyush. Thank you so much for inviting me. I visited Martin Chaudhary more than 2 years ago now and had a very nice visit with Pratyush, and many of you were there. So I'm very pleased to speak to all of you. Martin Chaudhary is widely known as one of the great research institutes in Nepal in social sciences. And I'm starting some work in Nepal, I hope. I've been starting it for a long time, but COVID has stopped it. So I hope to engage with all of you as that work goes along. On the small audience, in my private life, I study Indian classical Hindustani music, and my guru used to say that the smaller the audience, the more knowledgeable the audience. So it's a better audience to speak to. So I'm absolutely thrilled that you have come on the early days of Dasara. I know it's holidays for you. Anyway, let me just plunge into the talk. I'm going to share my screen and just talk about this book. So this is the book that I did with Paromita Sanyal in 2018, as Pratyush said. And let me just plunge right into it. And I want to, in the Q&A, hopefully discuss the relevance of the book for Nepal, which I'm actually personally interested in learning from you as well. But I think it might have some relevance. So let me plunge into it. We all know that democracy, as currently practiced, is in trouble all over the world. There's not a country in the world which is a so-called democracy where democracy is not under threat. And there are various kinds of threats. The most old-fashioned and obvious one is elite capture, that elites dominate, elite interests capture democratic outcomes. The second one is the problem of clientelism, where particular groups are associated with particular politicians, so everybody's trying to divide everybody in order to gain their votes and play that vote bank game. The third one is obviously corruption. Elections themselves are sometimes responsible for corruption because people steal in order to run for election and pay for campaigns. But then there's another side, is the next book that I'm working on, is that democracy has become a business. People get into politics to make money. This is endemic in South Asia, certainly true of my country, India. And all of this has caused the crisis of legitimacy. The idea of elections being legitimate forms of selecting a leader, people are increasingly skeptical of, people are getting increasingly skeptical of the idea of democracy. So many people fear, including me, that we may not have democracy for that much longer, even in countries like the US. It's a threat, it's under threat. So I think it's time to rethink what democracy is. Now, how do we make democracy more relevant, more meaningful for people, so that the average citizen feels that they have a stake in the outcome, that they have a voice in the outcome, that they're able to affect outcomes. Yeah. So in some ways, this takes us back to other types of democracy. The most obvious one to think about is the old idea of deliberative democracy, which goes back to the Greeks, but also in the Indian subcontinent, it's been a very old system of making decisions where communities get together and come to some common understanding about what to do. Yeah. Yes, there are leaders and so on, but everybody sort of comes to some form of consensus. John Elster has a very nice way of describing this. He says elections are about the aggregation of preferences. You vote for somebody, I vote for somebody, a third person votes for somebody. We add up the votes, so there's an aggregation, and we select a representative who then represents our interests, which is the one that is under threat. Deliberation, on the other hand, is about the transformation of preferences. If you and I have different ideas about what we want to do, I will try my best to persuade you of that point of view, and we'll agree and then come to some understanding. Yeah. So the question then becomes, what do we learn from this and in the contemporary context? How relevant is it for the subcontinent in particular, but for the world at large? Because there's a lot of theoretical work, normative work in deliberative democracy, particularly by political philosophers, most famously Habermas. And if you look at Habermas's work, which is, he's one of the world's great philosophers, it presumes equality, and it doesn't even talk about literacy. It assumes everybody is literate. Yeah, but that is the presumption of equality. I mean, he's talking about Europe largely, and coffee shops in Vienna and people discussing these ideas. And my concern with a lot of the South Asian political science literature, historical literature, is that they've taken these Habermasian ideas wholesale and try to apply it to Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so on, where they don't have much relevance. We are different societies. We are ridden by caste inequality, by ethnic differences, by gender inequality, and of course, good old-fashioned wealth and income inequality. And also, we have large proportions of populations that are basically illiterate. Yeah. Under those circumstances, how does deliberation work? That's one big challenge. That's one big concern. The second thing is, I mean, how does it work on a large scale in a real world setting? I mean, a lot of the sort of empirical work that people are testing various ideas of deliberation are done by Western scientists in a lab. So they have the so-called weird problem, which is they're testing ideas with American undergraduates or European undergraduates. What relevance does this have for regular people in the South Asian context? Yeah. So how do we study this thing at scale? How do we study it when it is affecting millions of people? Yeah, and India gives us that opportunity because, as some of you might know, in 1992, India passed the 73rd Amendment to the Indian Constitution, which established. I mean, Nepal is a different use of the word panchayat, but in India, the village panchayat system, the gram panchayat system, was established, or let's say formalized, under that constitutional amendment, which required every village in India to have democratically elected village councillors and a village president, to have at least one third of all seats in the gram panchayat to be reserved for women, yeah, and to have a certain proportion of seats to be reserved for scheduled castes, for Dalits, and scheduled tribes, proportionate to their proportion in the population, yeah. And the third big innovation in the 73rd Amendment was that every village would have what we call the Gram Sabha, which would be held between 2 to 4 times a year, yeah, where any citizen of the village, any resident of the village was welcome to participate, was invited to participate and make important decisions. What were those important decisions? How should the village budget be spent? How should we spend the money? Yeah. How should public welfare programs be allocated, ratifying the beneficiaries of public programs? Yeah. So these are consequential decisions in the context of rural India that the Gram Sabha was given responsibility for. Okay. Now, what is sort of interesting about the Indian federal structure, as the case is in Nepal now, is that a lot of the action doesn't happen at the federal level, at the central level. The action happens at the state level, because that constitutional amendment is interpreted by each state government under a state government act, which actually affects how it plays out in each state. Yeah. So we now have a situation where you have these gram sabhas all over the country for almost 30 years that have affected 850 million people in 2 million villages. Huge scale. Yeah. And nobody, it's a subject that has not been studied that much, so which is why we wrote this book. So what we're going to ask in this book, we're going to study the 4 South Indian states. Now there are 5, but I'll come to that in a second. The 4 South Indian states, because the data were collected between 2002 and 2004, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka. And the analysis is not on outcomes. There's other work that talk about outcomes. Do gram sabhas improve the quality of public services and so on? It's another body of work that I'm involved with. This particular thing is asking this question of voice. Yeah. When people speak, what are they saying in those gram sabhas? What is the nature of the conversation? Is there inequality of voice? Are upper caste more likely to speak than lower caste? If lower caste speak, what are they speaking about? Are women less likely to speak than men? If they speak, what are they speaking about? Is there a conversation with the state in these groups? Is there civic agency? Is there civic capacity? Yeah, that's the big question. The book also goes through the intellectual and political history of deliberative democracy in the Indian subcontinent. And we try to tease out, using a natural experiment, whether policy interventions can improve the quality of local government and particularly of deliberate democracy. That's one question, one big question. The second big question is, how does literacy affect the quality of deliberation? Yeah. So let me. All right. So what is the history of the Gram Sabha? As we know, this is not something that is unfamiliar to anybody in South Asia. There's a long history of debate and dialogue in the Indian subcontinent in every religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, even the Christians who came to the subcontinent have a long history of debate and dialogue. Yeah. And in fact, all over South Asia, you had village panchayats, village republics, prevalent under every empire, under every regime, going back thousands of years. Yeah. Now, what is interesting, I mean, the modern Gram Sabha, where does it come from? And in the Indian case, this is a little bit interesting because it's actually due to a fellow called Henry Maine in 1876. Henry Maine was the legal advisor to the East India Company, to the British government, if you wish. And he wrote a book called Village Communities in the East and West, where he sort of discovered all these panchayats. So that to take a white guy to tell us about what we already had, right? Of course. But he discovered all these village panchayats. And it deeply affected a fellow called Lord Ripon, who was a very radical politician in the UK, who was kicked out of the UK because people felt that he was too radical for British government. And he was appointed as the Viceroy of India. Yeah. And he laid the foundations with the Indian Local Government Resolution in 1882 for the Indian Panchayat local government system. India meaning the British part of the Indian subcontinent. Now, John Stuart Mill saw all this, read Henry Maine, saw Ripon's work. In fact, Ripon was sort of a friend and student of John Stuart Mill. And he thought about, that's what his ideas about democracy, local democracy being the training ground for democracy come from. Gandhiji takes all this up in his attempt to reinvent a new form of Indian nationalism under the label of village Swaraj. And he believes very strongly that in the idea of village republics, tries to promote it all over India, doesn't necessarily succeed because he had two people opposing him. Jawaharlal Nehru, who wanted Soviet-style large-scale industries and a sort of an industrial route out of poverty. And of course, Babasaheb Ambedkar, who felt that village republics would be highly subject to elite capture and capture by upper castes. And he said, this is not something we want. We want a different kind of India. So Gandhi's ideas on this subject didn't really take ground till, I would argue, 1992. You had various sort of versions of this. In my home state of Karnataka, you had the Mandal panchayat system that was established by a wonderful man called Abdul Nazir Saab in 1985. You had Gaon Saabs in Uttar Pradesh and so on. But it's only in 1992 that all of this happened. And of course, the state government acts come into place after the 73rd Amendment, 96 and onward up to 2000. Okay, so let me just plunge into some basic information about the differences between different types of how different states in South India have translated the 73rd Amendment into practice. Yeah. So if you take Kerala, that's the highest capacity. It's the canonical example. It's the one that's done it the best. They had something called the People's Campaign, where they sort of took ideas of participatory development plus ideas coming from communism about cadres and so on, and set up these nested planning systems, seminars as they call it, right? Where you start with the street level, where people on the street come together and say what their needs at the street level are. That is then consolidated to the ward level. The ward level then goes to the village level. The village level goes to the panchayat level. Panchayats sometimes have more than one village. Yeah, and the state government, state governments being very powerful in India, said that 40% of the state budget in the government of Kerala, to this day this is true, is given directly to panchayats to spend. Yeah, so they have huge budgets. And of course, Kerala famously has 100% literacy. So they've had that for a while. So literacy is not an issue. In that sense, it's almost a Habermasian case, except there is forms of inequality. So let's call that high capacity Kerala. Karnataka and Tamil Nadu are what we call medium capacity, because the panchayats were given a fair amount of power and fair amount of resources. Karnataka has a parliamentary style election of president. Tamil Nadu has a presidential style of election for the village president. But it's not quite the Kerala case. Nowhere close. Yeah, because they don't give that kind of money. They don't give that kind of power. The worst case is the old state of Andhra Pradesh, which has now been split for the last 5 years into Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. And we'll be talking about both parts of it, but I'm really talking about old Andhra Pradesh here, which I'm calling low capacity, because there was a fellow called Chandrababu Naidu, who was chief minister of Andhra Pradesh, who absolutely hated the panchayat system. So he did everything to undermine it. He wanted it very technocratic. He was a big, the World Bank loved him. I mean, I remember, I'm in the research department of the World Bank, so I'm not involved in the lending programs. So we can be a little more objective what the World Bank does. The World Bank loved this man because he was very technocratic. Every stupid idea the World Bank threw out, he would take on and start doing there. And of course, lost the elections after one term. But anyway, while he was there, he completely undermined the panchayat system, made sure that it didn't have resources, made sure it had, didn't even hold elections till he was hauled to the Supreme Court of India and forced to hold elections to the panchayat system. Yeah. So we'll call Andhra Pradesh low capacity. All right. I'm not going to go through this literature; it's sort of irrelevant. Let me just go straight down into describing the book. What we did, we recorded about 300 gram sabhas between 2003 and 2004, which were then transcribed and translated from the 4 South Indian languages. We used a natural experiment. I'll explain that in a second. And we made sure that our villages had variations of literacy. The book is really what I call a handmade analysis. There's no machine learning, no computer sort of learning here, no computer analysis. I've done that in other work, but in this case, it was all done by hand by Paromita and myself, mainly by Paromita. And in the process, it took 10 years. Many, many things happened in both our lives in that process. So that's what happens when books take so long to work on. But here's the national experiment. You might be familiar with this map of South India. What may be less familiar is the history of South India. And prior to 1947 Indian independence, let's go back to the end of the Mughal era in the 18th century. When Aurangzeb dies and various other emperors come, or Mughal emperors come up, the Mughal empire starts crumbling, and various governors of different states of provinces under the Mughal empire start establishing their own independent states. The biggest one of them is the state of Hyderabad, which was run by the Nizam of Hyderabad. It's a big territory, and you can see the map there with those crisscross lines. Then, of course, the British, battling people like Tipu Sultan and others, start taking over territory, and they establish the Madras Presidency, which is directly run by the British. And the Madras Presidency goes all the way through what is modern Andhra Pradesh, through Tamil Nadu to parts of Karnataka. Yeah. Then you have the princely state of Mysore, which actually had a lot to do with Nepal at some point, and so on. Yeah. 1956, and each of these old political entities had various languages being spoken. They were multi-ethnic, multilingual political entities. 1956, the Panikkar Committee comes in and says, under Nehru, that Indian states should be linguistically organized. So each state within its borders should have one language that becomes the language that people in the state speak. So states were reorganized, the borders were reorganized to have those people speaking the same language brought together. So you have the modern state of Andhra Pradesh, where they speak Telugu, Karnataka, where they speak Kannada, Tamilnadu, where they speak Tamil, and Kerala, where they speak Malayalam. Okay, so what we are given, I mean, if you read social linguistics, there is a concept there for the linguistic community. And the idea there, which is very important for our book, is that where does discourse come from? Styles of discourse, how we talk within groups in particular, or even within families, where does that come from? And they say it comes from different things. It comes from administration and politics and history. Yeah, so there's a long historical roots to many of these things. That's one thing. Secondly, it comes from language. Different languages have different styles of speech. Yeah. Thirdly, it comes from geography. If we live in the same, more or less the same sort of geographic zone, the same ecological zone, we tend to have closer linguistic ties, closer communal ties with people in that zone. So what is the national experiment? National experiment we're running is the following. If we compare villages that have had the same administrative history for 300 years, that speak the same language, but because of this border division in 1956 belong to different states now, then any differences we observe in the Gram Sabha of these places is not cultural. It is because of the policy of the state government. So therefore, it is changeable. It's not something that's resistant to change, like people say culture is. I don't believe that, but that's the received wisdom out there. Yeah. So how do we do this? We pick. I don't know if you go. Let's pick the Hyderabad entity, the old Hyderabad state. We pick two districts in Hyderabad state, Bidar and Medak, that prior to 1956 were effectively the same district, the district of Medak. They were all in the district of Medak under Hyderabad, the province, the sub-province of Medak. They were split into different states after 1956. Bidar went to Karnataka, Medak went to Andhra Pradesh. Now, when you do these linguistic divisions, as you might have seen in Nepal as well, where, with the new constitution and the new division, you cannot, slice things in such a way that you're only going to have Kannada speakers in Karnataka and Telugu speakers in Andhra Pradesh. You're going to have mistakes made. Yeah, so those are the mistakes that we compared. We compared Telugu speakers in Bidar with Telugu speakers in Medak. Similarly, in the Kerala Tamilnadu border, we compared Tamil speakers in Kerala with Tamil speakers in Tamil Nadu. In the Kerala Karnataka border, we compared Kannada speakers in Kerala with Kannada speakers in Karnataka, and in the Tamil Nadu Andhra Pradesh border, Dharmapuri and Chittoor, we compared Telugu speakers in Tamil Nadu with Telugu speakers in Andhra Pradesh. Yeah. So therefore, we are comparing people from the same language, and also these villages are no more than 10 kilometers apart. So they're part of the same ecological zone. With all of this, they have the same history, same ecological zone, same language. They have a common entity. In fact, there's another paper I've written where they're the same caste structure in these villages, exactly the same caste structure. So they're sociologically very, very similar. The big difference is they belong to different states since 1956. So we're going to compare those things. These are pictures of some Gram Sabhas. This is Karnataka, this is Tamil Nadu. This gives you a sense of the sample of how many things we did. I'll come back to that. Some basic data on these Gram Sabhas. I want to be aware of the time, so I'm going to speed up a bit. The average duration of a Gram Sabha is about 1.5 hours. They're always delayed, as we do in South Asia. There are about 80 to 100 attendees usually. Fair representation of women, about 1/3. Women talk, they talk something, but when they talk, that's the talk indicator that 68% of Gram Sabhas have at least one woman talking. But what is interesting is women, when they talk, they don't talk much. They only dominate about 10% of the conversation. Yeah. Dalits come to these things. There's a fair amount of Dalit attendance, more than 1/3. And Dalits also seem to talk, but not as much as upper caste. Yeah. What are the topics that they talk about? These are areas which are prone to a lot of drought. So a lot of it is about drinking water. They're talking about roads. They're talking about education, electricity, housing, health, less so things like employment and agricultural issues. Okay. What we find in the book is there are different categories of discourse in our data. Well, the first one is what we're calling competition over public goods. They're arguing about how to spend the money, what to spend it on, the corruption that happens with public funds, and so on and so forth. There's also competition over private goods. Why is that person identified as poor when he or she is not? They have a big plot of land. They are the brother of the village president. They shouldn't be in the poor category. Why, on the other hand, this poor widow should be there because she doesn't have anything. So what happens with these poverty sort of line definitions in India is that it is determined by a survey. They have a score on the basis of that survey. On that score, if you fall below a certain score, you get what is called a BPL card. You're given access to ration cards and so on. Above it, you don't. But these have always have errors, both of exclusion and inclusion. Rich people are identified as poor because they get free benefits, while poor people are not given that definition, both sorts of errors. But in the Gram Sabha, when those lists are given to the Gram Sabha, debate happens about sorting that out. The next set of categories of standard issues in the politics of recognition. That's actually a big part of speech, is that Dalits trying to make themselves heard. I'll give you a very interesting example that is in the book. This was a meeting, a Gram Sabha in a drought-prone area, which was mixed caste. You had upper caste and Dalits in the village. But interestingly, there was a bit of an incline in the village. So a hill, slight hill. And at the top of the hill was where the upper caste lived. At the bottom of the hill is where the lower caste lived. Yeah. And remember, there was a lack of water. So this upper caste fellow is saying, in my well, in our well, we don't have water. Please do something. Our well has gone dry. So the Dalit guy stands up and says, please come to our well. We have plenty of water. Okay, fully knowing they're never going to come. Okay, so he's poking them in this space, showing them up for the discrimination that is intrinsic to that community. Okay, so that's a politics of recognition. You have the demand for governance, a sort of holding government to account, holding them up to saying about corruption or other things, the lack of delivery of public services. And then you have the state speaking. You have the village president speaking, the village secretary, who's the local bureaucrat speaking. You have high-level bureaucrats speaking. So a lot of states speak. But it becomes a space where people are really educating themselves, beginning. Remember, we recorded this 20 years ago when Gram Sabha was still new thing. So they're still beginning to figure out how to work on the space. If you go now, things are actually much better. Yeah. All right. So let me just skip that part. Actually, no. Let me stay there. We have some time. So let me go back. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some excerpts just to show you what shows up. This is a whole book. I should say you don't have to buy the book. It's a free download from Cambridge University Press. It's an open access book, so it's easily available. But what I want to do is to read some excerpts showing you the nature of our design to persuade you that, and I hope the book does, that this experiment actually shows something. So I'm going to begin. If you remember, we matched Chittoor district with Dharmapuri district. So we are talking about Telugu speakers in Andhra Pradesh, comparing them with Telugu speakers in Tamil Nadu, which are 10 kilometers or less apart. So these are the same people. But here's the Gram Sabha in Chittoor, which is, I'm going to read the entirety of the Gram Sabha. It went on for about 15 minutes. And I told you, Andhra Pradesh was a low capacity state. So the president opens by saying, today we are conducting this Gram Sabha to discuss the problems in our village and the various activities we have undertaken so far. You can express your problems here. A villager who is a youth community member says, there is no proper community hall in this village for holding meetings or events. We should construct a community hall. The president says, I will inform the government to construct a community hall and to provide all facilities to conduct meetings. I will try my level best to construct a community hall. A Dalit villager says, there is no cement road in the village. Cement road should be laid in all the village streets. President says, wherever we don't have cement roads, I will try and get them constructed at the earliest. Another Dalit villager says, there are electricity poles in the street, but the lights are not there. We should arrange for lights. The president says, I will arrange for street lights very soon. Another villager says, in the village, some people have huts. About 50 families have no houses to stay. So you should construct pakka houses for all the houseless people. We have permission to construct houses on the hill, but there is no road. The president says, I will discuss with the government officials about this problem. And then another villager says, we keep complaining about these things. No, nobody does anything. The president says, I've given a complaint to the district collector regarding this, but nothing has happened. I am helpless regarding this issue. Gram Sabha ends. That's it. It's over. Okay. Let's go to the next door village in Tamil Nadu and see what happens. This thing goes on for 2 hours, this meeting. Yeah. So I can't read the whole thing to you. It's a very long meeting. But you know, it starts with a big set of announcements made by the village secretary, and they start arguing about different things. Then they start arguing about sanitation. So a bureaucrat opens that sanitation discussion by saying, now the main agenda of today's meeting is to maintain the hygiene and cleanliness of the surroundings. This means that everyone should keep their house and their surroundings clean. If each one keeps their house and surroundings clean, the streets will be automatically clean. But no one does that. And this is why the government has made arrangements for a clean village. And that is the subject of today's meeting, hygienic and clean environment. And he goes on about sanitation. For instance, he says, say for your daily toileting need, you can use the unused land and fields, referring to open defecation. In villages, both men and women do that. But when these lands and fields are no longer there, then what would you all do for your daily need? Will it not become difficult? Males can go anywhere, but ladies will face a lot of problems. So what I say is that all of you should have a toilet. In cities, there are thousands of houses and each house has a toilet. It is clean. Has the city been spoiled? No. He's giving them a lecture about building their own toilets. So and he goes on about the subject for about 15, 20 minutes. So villagers start discussing this, you know, and basically they're saying, you know, you're telling us to build toilets. Where's the money? And the bureaucrat says, I'll give you 500 rupees. Villagers, what are we going to do with 500 rupees? You know, they can't build a toilet with 500 rupees. He says, you should give the rest of the money out of your pocket because it is important for you to have this. The villager says, we can't afford it. A lot of people are shouting at him. We can't afford it. We can't afford it. What are you talking about? Yeah. Increase the amount of money. And then this whole discussion becomes one big thing about how the villager points out the government has allocated 2,000 rupees and this fellow is giving them 500 rupees. So where is the rest of the money going? They're identifying corruption and talking about it in the Gram Sabha. Yeah. So very briefly, I mean, you can, the excerpt is much longer. What you've seen is a very, very, very different quality of discourse in Tamil Nadu than in Andhra Pradesh. Otherwise, the villages are almost the same. They're the same people, same language, same caste divisions, the same ecological zone. Completely different discourse. So that discourse has to do with the nature of government policy. Yeah. Let me take another example, and here I will compare the state of Tamil Nadu to the state of let's see. Actually, let's compare the state of Tamil Nadu to the state of Kerala, because this is interesting. Because Kerala, as I said, is a very high capacity state that really has done this very well. Tamil Nadu, this is comparing the district of Coimbatore, a village in the district of Coimbatore with a village in Tamil Nadu with the district of Palakkad in Kerala. And, the Coimbatore discussion is very similar to the one in Dharmapuri. The villager is saying, you say there is drought and water problem, but the water from the road pipe is getting wasted. This is a villager speaking. It is flowing non-stop in the roads and you have not done anything to stop that flow and fix the water stagnation. This problem has been there for the past 2 months. You're talking about rainwater harvesting. This fellow is saying you should do rainwater harvesting. That is not helping the public in any way, where we are not even able to walk on the road during the night. In every Gram Sabha meeting, we've been telling you things that have not been done for Jeevanananda Nagar. Whoever comes, gets elected as the head of the panchayat, this Jeevanananda Nagar is neglected. Nobody cares, despite us saying that in Gram Sabha meetings. There is no improvement for the last 30 years. There is no proper road. Even an auto rickshaw won't come because there's no road there. So they go on like this, telling the government representative of this problem, that, discussing why should we pay taxes? They're being told, you're not paid your taxes, there is no money. The guy says, why should we pay taxes when you're providing us services? Why should we pay any taxes? So that is the nature of a very, very spirited discussion. Now, we go to the neighboring state of district of Palakkad, another 10 kilometers away, and we're going to look at a Gram Sabha in Kerala. Now, the Kerala Gram Sabha is very different. Why is it different? Because all the deliberation has happened at the lower level. It's happened at the neighborhood level. It's happened at the ward level. They have constructed their plans. They've come to a consensus on their plans. All that happens when you reach the high level of the Gram Sabha is they're announcing those plans. So it's a very, very boring meeting. All the hard work has been done. They're just making announcements. I'm going to read those announcements to you. This thing is 1 hour of announcements, the most boring meeting to read. Vice President saying, I'm again reading, within the last phase of the financial year 2005-2006 planning, according to government principles, we are organizing this Gram Sabha of planning the development of the next financial year 2006-07. As part of the new financial year 2006-07, we have organized working groups. Working groups have suggested some topics. The Gram Panchayat members have also made suggestions. Those suggested projects will be submitted to you. You will change those projects on the basis of the valid suggestion, then formulate the working committee. The working committee implements the projects with the help of the ruling committee. We cannot implement all your suggestions, but we must amend the project on the basis of the priority coming from the over 18 wards. There are around 10 groups like agriculture and allied activities, animal protection, poverty eradication, etc. It is informal to form these groups. We have to do a lot of things, blah, 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 blah. The guy goes on for 3 pages in the book. So it is a set of announcements. And the reason for that is that the deliberation has happened, decisions have been made. They're now announcing those decisions. Yeah. Again, you've seen that these historical differences, cultural differences, controlling for all of them. The big difference, the big thing that causes the quality of the Gram Sabha to be different is state government policy. In other words, democracy can be instituted by a policy intervention. It can be improved by a policy intervention. This is a lesson for Nepal as it is for anybody else. Yeah, and certainly for India. Yeah? You cannot say that democracy won't work because people don't have the capacity. I'll come to Partha Chatterjee in a second, who's done a great service to all of us in South Asia by talking about this political society and civil society, and that rural areas cannot have civic capacity. It's absolute nonsense. I was going to use a stronger word, and we've given you evidence for that. Read the book, you will see there's plenty of civic capacity in rural areas with illiterate folks and literate folks and everybody. We have to give them the chance to do it properly, give them to channel it, to give them resources. So let's go to literacy now. Literacy, the experiment is slightly different. Remember, for looking at the effect of state policy, we're comparing across 2 districts that have been matched. But to look at the effect of literacy, we're going to the same district in the same state and comparing low literacy villages with high literacy villages, or low literacy villages, medium literacy villages within the same state, within the same district. Yeah. What is interesting about the whole literacy analysis in the book is that when in the state of Andhra Pradesh, where the panchayat system was completely undermined, literacy makes no difference. Whether you're low literacy or high literacy, it's basically the same. The quality of the Gram Sabha is just as bad. Yeah. In medium capacity states like Karnataka, there was a wide gap. Literacy did have an effect. And we found that in less literate places, a lot of people were silent, or they had what, Naomi Hussain has this wonderful word called rude accountability. You had a lot of screaming and shouting without any direction to the discussion. So then you had elite stewards coming in, more literate people coming in, trying to channel the discussion towards productive conversation. But as you got more literate, that got better. And we saw the similar sort of thing in both parts of Karnataka, in the Bidar start and the south of Karnataka. It seemed to be the Karnataka-wide effect. In Tamil Nadu, again, we see not much difference. It's a narrow gap. It's not zero gap, but it's a narrow gap. And the narrow gap really comes because Tamil Nadu has more or less an even setup across the state. Tamil Nadu doesn't have so many internal differences as Karnataka does. Kerala, there's zero gap because everybody's literate. So every Gram Sabha is just the same. So what are we learning from this? That literacy does matter. Nobody's saying it doesn't, but the poor and the illiterate do have a way of discoursing that is meaningful and does have some capacity. They do get better as they get more literate. What is interesting though is that even amongst the illiterates, you have the more literate trying to make sense of what the meeting is saying and trying to channel the discussion in productive ways. But literacy is overwhelmed by state capacity. If the state has taken no interest in the panchayat system or is an amazingly successful panchayat system, literacy doesn't matter again. Yeah. So that's sort of the big finding here, that literacy matters, but not as much as state capacity. Okay. So let me just wrap up because I'd like to have a discussion and urge you to read the book if you're interested. The point here is that, we all know about Sen's ideas of capabilities and so on, but the capacity to orate, the capacity to articulate, to plan, to deliberate is actually an important capacity, as much as the capacity to earn a living, the capacity to be educated, health, education, speaking, voice. Without any of that doesn't get translated into action. Yeah, and it is an unequally distributed capability. Yeah, it's something that in every South Asian tradition is a very important thing. I mean, going back to the Arthashastra, you see reference to this. Yeah, certainly with the Greeks and the Romans. It's related to the capacity to engage, because the capacity to speak can be translated into action, into engagement with the state. What our book shows, I think, overwhelmingly, is that the silly idea that there is some sort of difference in political and civil capacity where rural areas of South Asian countries don't have civic capacity. It's all in the cities and in coffee shops and amongst highly educated, wealthy people. That's simply not true. Rural areas of India, certainly, and certainly in the villages we look at, but I think it's true of all of rural South Asia, there's tremendous civic capacity. Yeah, we can call them a civil society. That's not simply a political society where they're sort of manipulated by this and that. That goes on, but that's not necessarily true. So in a world where electoral democracy is under threat, it should be supplemented. What we're showing, if you supplement electoral democracy, we don't say substitute, but supplement with deliberative systems, you get a much stronger ability for citizens to have a voice in democratic decision-making, to improve the nature of democratic decision-making, and becomes more meaningful for people in the village. Yeah. Now, the other important thing is it's not magic. It takes a long time to happen. I mean, you have to let it go. It's been going on in India now for close to 30 years, as I said, and slowly we're beginning to see effects across the country, but it's taken that long for it to take hold. Yeah. So you can't really imagine this as some sort of magic intervention, some RCT that you do and something magic happens. It's not like that. It's something that takes a long time. There are lots of ups and downs in the process. All right, let me stop there and ask if there are any questions, and let's have a discussion. I think that's the end of my presentation. Yeah, let's stop there.
Thank you, Biju, for that fascinating presentation. Before I open the floor for questions from whoever is interested, I had two questions briefly so that you could provide some additional context regarding your position in the bank and also the work that went into the making of this book. In Nepal, the intellectual scene is dominated by two things, right? One is the Nepali language, and B, left-leaning ideology in which ethnographic content, I think, is sometimes or most of the time rather weak, and polemics, particularly polemics that is targeted against World Bank's so-called neoliberal policies that make a negative impact on countries like Nepal. That kind of politics dominates. So briefly, could you say something about how is it that while working for the World Bank, you're able to do this kind of work? I mean, that takes many years to conceptualize and to gain clarity in your own mind and in the collaborative possibilities with colleagues who are not necessarily working within the bank. And secondly, I think something about the archive, the creation of the archive that allowed you to do this work. And as I was looking into your book, I mean, the transcripts are almost 20 years old. So these are activities, these are conversations that took place, and then the transcripts and the making of the transcript, but also then reading and rereading the transcripts again and again as an individual researcher with your collaborator, etc. Something along, something that throws light on that process as well, please.
Sure. Thanks, Pratyush. So, I mean, the World Bank has 18,000 people. It's a very, very big place, which means all kinds of people work at the World Bank. That's one point. What is also interesting of the World Bank, in contrast to, say, the UNDP or even to some extent to the IMF, is that it has an independent research department to which I belong, or which I'm a member. And that independent research department has freedom of speech. Now, you'll come back to me and say, what happened to the Doing Business report and those controversies just came? There are different divisions within that research department. Some of them are more subject to political manipulation, but our department, the researchers, have been relatively protected. Yeah? So we have relative freedom of speech. And the reason, and we've been around for 70 years, ever since the World Bank has been there. And the reason that's important is because we can subject the bank to internal critique and internal advice and bring in new ideas to how the bank thinks. Yeah? All of us, including me, have to spend, like professors teach, I have to give 1/3 of my time for internal consulting. I advise the bank on various projects. Interestingly, obviously, I have my style of research, I have my views. So the people who might pick me to work with them will share my views from the operations side. In fact, in Nepal, I mean, the kind of people I've worked with, you might know, are Caroline Sage and so on, who sort of share my views, right? Now, therefore, even in the operations side of the bank, you have a variety of voices, a variety of views that result in a lot of internal debate. Unfortunately, I wish the bank would be better at this. That internal debate is not shown to the public. What is shown to the public is the corporate decision that's made at the end, which is affected by all kinds of other considerations. So it is not incorrect. In fact, it is important, and I think it is centrally important for civil society in every country like Nepal and every other country that is influenced by World Bank policy to protest, to object, to hold the World Bank accountable, because nobody else does. Yeah, it's not set up, it's not an accountable system. So the only people it is accountable to, in fact, what is the World Bank doing? It is lending you money. It is telling you how to spend your own money, which your future generations will be paying off, right? So it is very important to hold the World Bank accountable. Yeah. Now, the World Bank sometimes does good. I mean, I hope to be involved in some of the World Bank's work in Nepal's local government, doing these kinds of things. I've been trying very hard to collaborate to bring in a broader set of voices from the Nepali civil society and Nepali intellectual community, not just people hired guns, that you pay money to repeat what the World Bank says, but to have a broader community brought in. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on in the World Bank. So you have, So in other words, the World Bank is not a monolith. You should not see it as a monolith. I'm not going to defend all the things the World Bank does. I have been critical. In fact, my book, Localizing Development, was a huge critique of the own bank's own work and participatory development. So, I see those issues. But certainly you can find allies within the bank in the way you think. Now, how did we get away with this work? I mean, the World Bank Research Department does the work of a researcher. So sometimes research takes a long time to happen. We recorded these things. I had some funding. We sent out teams of people to do the recordings. Then we got those transcribed and translated. Later on, I've done more recordings in the state of Tamil Nadu. I've done recordings in the state of Karnataka. I'm currently working in the state of Karnataka. Those will also take a few years to analyze. It takes a long time. I'm a strong believer that, polemics are important for public discourse, but they have to be informed by data. They have to be informed by facts. And those facts, no fact is objective, I accept that, but at least people should make the case that they're making for their polemical position with facts, with representative samples. You cannot say that I saw something in my travels to some village and therefore the whole world is like that. That's simply not true. Provide the evidence for that and have that evidence verifiable. You want to see my transcripts? I'll give you all the transcripts. You can look at it yourself. All data should be public. Yeah. Then we can start having a conversation. Once we agree that what the facts are, then we can have a conversation about how decisions are made. My concern with a lot of the efforts to improve local government in Nepal to some extent is that this idea of what a fact is not so straightforward. Whether it's a fact about the village has a problem or doesn't have a problem. So what we need is a better data system so we can all agree on facts. That particular part of that particular place in Nepal has a worse problem than this place, because we're going to show you data that makes sense and you can go and verify that data, yeah? Rather than have some expert telling you what that data is saying. Data has to be democratized. Data has to be made understandable. It cannot be something that divides the expert and the subject. So my entire life's career has been about reducing that distance. I don't think that distance can be completely eliminated, but let's try to reduce it so that citizens, experts, politicians, bureaucrats can engage in an equal conversation. That's what deliberation is about, right? So anyway, that's maybe a stupid idealistic goal, but I think we should at least try.
Thank you, Viju. I'm going to open up to the floor, but also tell them that if they want to ask questions in Nepali, they should go ahead and do that, and I will translate them for you. तपाईहरुलाई चाहिँ प्रश्न नेपालीमा सोध्न मन छ भने कृपया नेपालीमा सोध्नु होला र म त्यसलाई अंग्रेजीमा अनुवाद गरिदिन्छु सो दैट बिजुजीले चाहिँ त्यसलाई अंग्रेजीमा उत्तर दिन सक्नुहुन्छ। यहाँहरुलाई अब प्रश्न सोध्नलाई अहिले समय अर्को झन्डै आधा घण्टा जति छ, सुरु गरौँ। हात उठाउनुहोस् अथवा ठ्याक्क बोल्दाखेरि भइहाल्छ अनम्युट गरेर। कोही छैन
on chat.
म बोलौं म
हुन्छ भनौं त भनौं।
हजुर धेरै धेरै धन्यवाद प्रेजेन्टेसनको लागि। मेरो क्वेशन चाहिँ नि यो यहाँको जुन फाइन्डिङ छ फर्स्ट फाइन्डिङ सबैसँग म सहमत छु, तर फर्स्ट फाइन्डिङ एकदम इम्पोर्टेन्ट के लाग्यो भने कि आर्टिकुलेसन सबभन्दा इम्पोर्टेन्ट हुँदो रहेछ त्यो ओरल डेमोक्रेसीमा। त्यो गाउँमा जहाँ तपाईले रिसर्च गर्नुभयो त्यो साउथ इन्डियाको हो र हामी चाहिँ नि नर्थ इन्डियाको नजिकको ठाउँमा बस्छौँ। नर्थ इन्डियामा र हाम्रो ठाउँमा पनि हामीले के देखिरहेछौँ भने साउथ नेपाल र नर्थ इन्डियामा कि पोलिटिक्समा क्रिमिनलाइजेसन चाहिँ नि गाउँबाट सुरु हुँदो रहेछ र यो त्यति बेला बढेको छ जति बेला गाउँमा पैसा जान बढेको छ। सेन्टरले जब पैसा पठाउन बढाएको छ मात्रा, त्यसपछि चाहिँ नि क्रिमिनलाइजेसन पनि बढेको छ। सो मेरो प्रश्न के हो भने कि तपाईको यो सर्वेमा यो रिसर्चमा क्वेशन गर्नेलाई गाउँको मान्छेले ग्राम सभामा क्वेशन गर्दाखेरि आफ्नो कुराहरू राख्दाखेरि वा लिडरशिपको लाइनबाट फरक धार राख्दाखेरि त्यसलाई कस्तो खालको थ्रेटहरूको महसुस गर्नु पर्यो कि परेन र यो तपाईको बुझाइमा अब यो बुक त साउथमा केन्द्रित छ तर नर्थ र साउथमा यो डायनामिक्स फरक छ कि छैन? That's all.
I think I understood the question, Pratyush. So, I mean, it's a very good question. I think the Ramesh Parajuli had a similar question on chat. So, you know, two things to keep in mind. I mean, the question, if I can understand it correctly, is North and South India are very different. You've done all your work in South India. How relevant is it to North India, to Nepal and other places? So that's one question. And secondly, how in this mess that we have, that we call democracy in South Asia right now, is this kind of thing going to make a difference? I mean, dealing with corruption, dealing with capture, dealing with all kinds of things. Have I got that question more or less correct?
No, the first part you got correct. The second part is Tula had a more specific question, which is he thinks that in North India and also in aligned in the Nepal case, criminalization of politics at the village level has been closely tied with the increased flow of money, whether that was from the center or from other means. Okay. So he's saying that in these Gram Sabhas, if people are speaking out, are they facing more threats for being vocal, or what kinds of threat situations have developed after people have started to speak out?
Yeah, so both are great questions. Okay, let me start with the North-South question. You know, I've done work in Bihar in other contexts. I've been working in Bihar for about 11 years. Others have done work in Rajasthan. There's work in Madhya Pradesh. So there's good work coming on this subject in West Bengal on these issues. There is also very good work coming out in Nepal. That, as you know, I mean, the simple point we're making in this book is civic capacity exists, and people, if given the opportunity, will deliberate and can make decisions. You cannot argue that somehow because people are illiterate or poor that they don't have that capacity, right? So now North India and South India are very different, but because the Gram Panchayat institution has the constitutional amendment behind it, and therefore the Supreme Court behind it, North India is getting much and much better in how it exercises the Gram Sabha. You read Gabby Crooks-Wisner's book on Rajasthan. You even read Adam Auerbach's work on cities in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. That becomes very, very clear that sort of engagement, Rachel Brule's work, is beginning to become very visible. Yeah, South India, in other words, I mean, again, South India has a lot of variation. The district of Bidar that I showed you, I've worked in that for many years also. I call it Bihar without water. Yeah, I mean, Bihar, like parts of Nepal, has plenty of rainfall and is very poor. This place has no rainfall, but is still very poor and very casted and very, very patriarchal and very active Gram Sabhas. Yeah. So if the space is given and it is a protected space, then these things happen. Now, what do I mean by a protected space? It's interesting. In these Gram Sabhas that we recorded, there is equality of voice and agency, because the politicians are scared that if they start interfering the Gram Sabha, they will face political consequences in the electoral booth. Yeah. So long as those elections are free and fair, and that's important, they have to be free and fair, the Gram Sabha becomes protected. Yeah. So people say things in the Gram Sabha they would never dare say in their private lives. And in fact, a lot of the villages' own local activities, you start engineering to some extent, you start seeing in these villages a sort of mini social movement occurring in that village level social movement. People come and make their case, they're trying to exercise their interests. Yeah. There's no question that the influx of money into local governments raises the interests of what you might call political entrepreneurs to come in and try to take that money away. In fact, that is what the subject of my next book is. There's no question about it, even in these villages. That is going to happen. The question is, can we begin a process by which that form of corruption, that form of extraction can be held accountable by citizens with greater power? Yeah. So you have to have a countervailing force. That countervailing force comes by giving citizens power in things like village meetings. If you legislate that all public funds should not only be reported to the Gram Sabha, but should be allocated by the Gram Sabha rather than by the village president, immediately you change the power equation. They'll have to start dealing with these people. They might have to bribe them, whatever they have to do. But that countervailing force comes in. Yeah. There's another question which you haven't asked, but people do ask: is local level corruption worse than higher level corruption? I absolutely don't think so. I mean, governments are corrupt at every level. Yeah. Local level corruption is more visible, and that's actually a good thing, because it's more visible to people living there and to others, but particularly to people living there. I mean, I have been to many, many, many villages all over India, and the extent of knowledge of how money is being stolen is extraordinary amongst local villagers. They know everything. They know exactly how to do. They want to participate. They want to be part of that system. Yeah. So that knowledge can be translated into better citizen services. It doesn't happen magically. It doesn't happen overnight. But you have to create the institutional structure that provides a countervailing force. Okay, so that's the case we're making. We're not at all claiming that this is some sort of a magically better system. It is moving towards that. Is the case I'm making.
प्रदीप जीले केही प्रश्न सोध्न चाहनुभयो हो?
हजुर, yes.
सोध्नु न, please.
हजुर, yes. Thank you, Vijayendra, for a very nice talk. I would confess that I have not read your book yet, and I will keep it in my list. It's really nice. Like you discussed that in politics of recognition, the issue with one of the Dalits raised was really beautiful. Now my question is, as this Gram Sabha is happening since long time in Indian society, as you said, in Nepal, and as you said, Dalits also raised their voice there. But why, in your study, you think you found that Dalits problem or Dalits discrimination is still there when they are apparently heard in these meetings like this? Is it that they are, first of all, not being allowed to speak there, or in general, they are not heard of whenever they raise their issues? Or is it in the decreasing trend that more Dalits are participating and people are recognizing their voice and their some sort of discriminatory behavior is decreasing? What did you find in your study? Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks for your question, Pradeep. So, caste discrimination in India as in Nepal is a long-standing, thousands of year old situation. And it's intersectional. So it's not just discrimination in voice, it's discrimination in wealth, in power, and everything. Right? And the Indian Constitution, since Babasaheb Ambedkar wrote that Constitution, has been trying very hard to equalize those differences via reservations, by political reservations, all kinds of things, and also at the panchayat level. What the data is showing, is that at least in economic terms, certain subsections of the larger Dalit community, certain jatis within the Dalit community are getting better off in some states. And you have what they're calling the creamy layer that exists all over India as well. You see data on that. That doesn't mean that everybody has moved out of poverty or that caste discrimination has disappeared. But what you're finding at the local level in village politics is that Dalit participation has increased. More Dalits are running for office, and Dalits vote in extremely large numbers, which therefore moves the equation of power slightly more in their favor. I'm not claiming that it is in their favor, but it's relatively better off. So all of these systems move the graph slowly in the favor of those who haven't had power traditionally. What then happens is that hopefully a sort of momentum picks up over time that makes it better and better and better, because that nature of that competition, that political competition, gets more and more equal. So again, I don't want you to take away from this that this is somehow magically changed everything. No, it has made things better. That's the only case I'm making. And we still have a long way to go.
Is Ramesh still here? I cannot see his question in the chat. So can
It
you
was
ask?
a north-south question. It was a north-south
Okay.
question. He sent it to me. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
I had a question.
Yes, Sarah, go ahead.
Is there, I understand the great point you're making around its state capacity is key. Is there, in your research and other stuff that you've done since this book, is there any sort of, have you seen a learning process between states? So that's saying that, you know, that this actually works and those that would be inclined to being more democratic, of course. Do you see a learning process taking place? That's my first question. The second question goes to, okay, so civic capacity exists everywhere in some form or another, and it's not necessarily tied to literacy, blah, blah, blah. How does this, I guess you kind of hinted at it, how does the link with civic capacity existing and can be cultivated, built up with state capacity and input? Have you seen any links to that increasing civic capacity to, for example, interventions into law, interventions into policies, so that we can actually see a direct link saying, okay, great, we have civic capacity, but then how does that then translate into some meaningful policy at the local level? Can you give us any examples? Of course, I'm interested in, because I also am interested in local level government. In fact, Caroline introduced us ages ago when you were having those discussions. So anything that you could share on that would be great.
Yeah, nice to see you, Sarah. Yes, we did meet, I remember, a couple of years ago, maybe more than that now. Okay, so first, are states learning from each other? The answer is absolutely. Yeah. So there are two big movements going on in India to raise civic capacity in rural areas. One is this panchayat system. The other one is the women's self-help group movement, which is, you know, completely taken over the country. And in both, as I've documented in various papers, governments are learning from each other a lot. Perhaps not always in the best way, but they're certainly learning from each other. Kerala is still seen as the sort of the lodestar, you know, that everybody wants to reach. But even the 70th Amendment wouldn't have happened if Karnataka hadn't instituted what they call the Mandal Panchayat system in 1985. So the 70th Amendment built from Karnataka state and took it all over the country. And then states are now constantly learning from each other. Yeah? So that the answer to that is absolutely yes. On your second point, has this increase in civic capacity resulted in real outcomes? Yeah? And you asked about legal outcomes and so on, but so legal outcomes are not relevant in the Indian case because there's no local level judicial body that can be influenced by legal outcomes. These panchayats don't have legal authority; they have administrative authority. So that doesn't apply here, unfortunately. I know in Nepal the situation is different, but you can ask a bigger question. Is all the civic capacity resulted in better public services? Is it resulting in better, fairer allocation of less corruption in the allocation of welfare benefits? We have shown in the allocation of welfare benefits that when Gram Sabhas are held, those allocations are fairer. They result in less corruption. Yeah. Others have shown, for instance, Manoj Mohanan at Duke University has shown that when you have institutions like the Gram Sabha, health outcomes are improved. You know, they tend to be better implemented. Yeah. Now, on other things like the implementation of, say, better roads or better wells or better schools, we don't find that evidence as yet. Yeah. We do find it in Kerala, for sure. We do find it in higher capacity states. We do find it to some extent in Tamilnadu and Karnataka, but in lower capacity states, that's not happened. And the reason for that, I think, is that the translation of the improved level of civic voice into reducing corruption, into making sure that those benefits accrue to citizens, that translation takes a long time. And that's what we're trying very hard to change. Now, what you're trying to do is to use our capacity as educated citizens or as World Bank officials or as government officials to change, to shift power in the favor of citizens. But that top-down interest in making that happen is not true in every state. In fact, as I showed you in the state of Andhra Pradesh, it's simply not there. Yeah. In the state of Kerala, there are a lot. So that comes back to this basic point that the top has to support the bottom. The bottom cannot act on its own. Yeah, and that's where I think that whole thing has to be taken to heart. You want to improve the capacity of local government, find ways of supporting the less powerful within that local government system, not just supporting high-level politicians. How do you make that happen? So we're thinking of different things, and we've done different things. One of the things is the control of information. But that's not enough, but it is necessary, not sufficient. We're thinking about trying to find ways by which the Gram Sabha, equivalents of the Gram Sabha in the state of Karnataka, for instance, are given real teeth. That those decisions have to be ratified in the Gram Sabha like a parliament. Yeah. So if you're going to allocate so much money for a road, not only does that budget have to be presented, it has to be voted on by the Gram Sabha, and then the outcome has to be presented to the Gram Sabha. Here's the road, go check the road out, make sure it's all right. If it's not all right, sanction the village president. Now, when you get to that point where the Gram Sabha is not just a place to speak, but to act with power, when you give them teeth, that's when you start seeing a shift in outcomes. Yeah? That, unfortunately, the only place that happens to date in India is in Kerala. And to some extent in the northeastern states. So yeah, and that is because the state government doesn't want to give them that authority, which I think is unfortunate.
If nobody else has a question, then I have a sort of a tangential question. I mean, the point you made about criticizing Partha Chatterjee's idea of political society. If we remember when he was making this argument at the end of the 1990s, this was a decade when institutions, including the one for which you work, were celebrating civil society at large in many different ways. And I think the message or the point that I had taken from reading Partha at that time in various avatars was that he was actually making a case of reminding these institutions that there were large swaths of the world in which the civil society that the imagined civil society of these big institutions didn't exist. I had not read him in the way you've interpreted it today, and also in the introduction to your book, in the way of civic capacity. Rather, I had read him more in the way of an ethnographic category. So I will have to read the rest of your book to actually get to the point. But if you wanted to make some kind of a comment on whether my reading was also can be considered a legitimate reading of Partha of that, of that time, then I would invite some comment.
No, Pratyush, I think you're right. Yeah. So you and I are coming from different places to this literature. I'm coming to it as an economist. I might be interdisciplinary, but I'm at the end an economist. You're coming to it as a historian, as a political theorist, and so on. And you read it before I did. Yeah, I only read this stuff around 2004 or 5, and you read it much before that. So I'm reading it as, and it may be an incorrect reading, but the point is that people keep citing his work, not himself perhaps, but I keep seeing it cited all the time as this political society and civil society division. And really, that's maybe I'm not criticizing him as much as people who have followed him, because I'm reading it much later than you did, right? So I think your point is well taken, and you've taught me something. So I'll keep that in mind next time I talk about Partha Chatterjee and this work. So I have no debate with you. I take that point.
अरु केही प्रश्नहरु टिप्पणीहरु छन् कि?
I have one, another one.
Yes, go ahead.
Did someone else want to speak? I don't know how to do the hand raising thing. Your issue, the point that you pointed about state capacity, and obviously Kerala is a great example because they want to change and they're doing these stuff. But so how does one, so then the question goes, how does one then introduce the catalyst to change state capacity that would want to help citizens, right? And in a country like Nepal, as you know, post-conflict, we're apparently a fragile state and everyone's into state building. And a lot at the lower level is going into state building now, right? At the lower level, you help local governments, and a lot of donor money, including that of the World Bank, is to build up these local state institutions. And the kind of building up that they are in large form doing is basically building up the same elites to be in power at the local level, so that these elites are being empowered. And so what is happening is precisely what we would not like to happen in the name of capacity building, right? So that's one problem. The second problem is our local elites have also, what they've done is, where the kind of gram panchayat kind of discussions and deliberations are allowed is only at the ward level. And I know you're now familiar enough, it's at the ward level. The ward level discussions and what discussions do take place, what participation, what information is given to them, all of the usual, has no real policy or other kinds of impact at the municipality level. The two are completely divided. The ward level is just a service place, and that's the only point of deliberation at the local level. So not only do you have capacity building of elites, and these would be your normal usually, so you've got the bureaucrats and the high caste, male, blah, blah, blah. You've got the local level politicians, some via the quotas come in are women, you know the story, right? But it's basically the same old elite in most of the provinces have taken over. So now you have a dilemma. Where does the catalyst for that change come, especially when you think of the larger discourse of Nepal's entering this federal phase? It's a great opportunity. We can make it more down. And clearly, all indications are showing that it's going in the opposite direction, or there are some spaces opening up, but it's very limited, and certainly not the opportunity, not the kinds of opportunity that we imagined when the constitution was being written would open up and then be devolved down to the local level and contoured at the local level. Is not helping. And a large part of that is because of donor intervention. Any thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, it has to change. That's my one thought. I've been trying to follow the Nepali work that's coming out from, I forget the name of the institute that's doing all the democratic tracking work. Nepal has a problem that's slightly different from India, at least India today, which is it's subject to donor domination much more than India is. So every fad, every little stupid idea is thrown at people and at the country with money. And donors have their own dynamic, their own politics, their own need to shine within their organizations and so on. And that then in turn affects millions of people, sometimes in extremely adverse ways and sometimes in positive ways. So keeping that in mind and keeping Nepal's own politics in mind, I think we all have to play a role in trying to shift that dynamic. I want to play my role, and my role is within my organization at this point. And I guess you guys have to play your role within the country. The question is, what do we do? How do we change that dynamic? This is me as Vijayendra Rao, lead economist in the research fund of the World Bank. At this point, don't have enough information to make a good articulate case for, as you have just done, Sarah. I would like to be at that point. So I can write something that says basically what you said, but with evidence that is convincing, that says that this way that it's being done is benefiting elites. So first we need to do some solid data collection and research to make that point in ways that convinces, that is incontrovertible, basically, right? And then to ask about how to shift it. What you're saying, I mean, if you read my book, Localizing Development, you'll see that this is common to a lot of donor-based projects that try to induce local participation all over the world. Yeah, they do it so badly because they look at the short-term benefit to the donor. To get the money out, to get whatever outcomes they see, government has signed off, wonderful, we passed a loan, we passed this money, with all these quote unquote people benefited, whatever it is, without lasting change. So they don't have a long-term perspective, they have a short-term perspective. What is remarkable about Nepal's 2017 constitution is the opportunity it presents. The reality may be different, but it's the opportunity it presents. And I'm sure all you folks in Nepal feel that way, that opportunity may be squandered. So the question is, what can the bank do better? What can the bank do differently? Yeah. I mean, I think that's where we got to listen to you guys, right? I mean, we have to bring in this. And my main thing with the bank in Nepal right now is that I think everybody is extremely well-intentioned, but I think it could do better. Yeah? And what that exactly means is something that we'll all have to. I mean, remember, I'm not coming with money. I'm no powerful guy within the World Bank. I'm a researcher. Yeah, but research can be a tool to change how people see things, to show people things. Yeah, so that policies are made different. How do you change that dynamic is something that I think I struggle with. I mean, I know how to do it to some extent in my own country because I play that game of being a researcher and stepping out and stepping in. Yeah, I'm not a Nepali. In fact, I'm an Indian. So I don't know how to do it in Nepal. And I certainly don't want to impinge on Nepali, here's this Indian scholar coming and writing all this stuff. That's not the way that I should be functioning personally. And I think the bank should be listening more to Nepali civil society broadly, locally and nationally. How we make that happen, let's do something together. That's all I mean, that's, let's get the data, let's get a qualitative data, let's improve our understanding of this elite capture and how it's happening and what's exactly going on. And let's shift the dynamic. To me, the one biggest tool that I know works is in giving actual powers to citizen bodies. Yeah, and making sure that those citizen bodies are allowed to be as open as possible because they are mandated to be so, and with money. Yeah. That doesn't change things magically overnight, but at least heads in the right direction. That's the one tool I have, or I know of. And then how do we do that? So we're thinking of democratizing data systems. So one of the things that Netra Paramiswamy, who's the poverty economist in Nepal, and I are thinking of working on is helping building systems where citizens collect their own data, both on common property and on public goods and on public welfare and so on, so that then they can track it locally. So everybody knows what's going on. Where does the money go? How it is being spent? What the outcomes are? And so then we can have a public discourse on whether that's been allocated well or not at the local level, public at the local level, and at the national level. So that's certainly something on the cards. It's certainly something that I'm actually starting next week to start talking to Netra about, and she's very keen on doing that. She's got support from the World Bank on that. And we're going to start doing it in 8 or 9 municipalities to begin with. Any other ideas are welcome. I mean, what do you think? I mean, let me throw the question back at you. What should the World Bank do differently? What can it do differently? And what are the things that you feel are most egregious about what the World Bank is doing right now on this space? I mean, there are many things that I have no I think we'll go outside the conversation, but on the local government space.
Sarah, do you want to respond, or should we wrap up for today?
Oh, I think we should wrap up because time is going. But we can talk about it later. But thanks, Biju. That was great.
अरु कसैको केही प्रश्न छैनन् भने आजको लागि चाहिँ म यो छलफल रोक्छु. केही छोटो प्रश्न छ कसैको? छैन जस्तो छ. So Biju, I think we've run out of time for today. Many thanks for waking up and talking early in your morning. It's over 6:30 now. As I said earlier, I wish more people had joined this conversation, but hopefully, if you come to Nepal in early 2022, we might be able to do a session like this in person. If not, we can always do this in webinar. So let me thank you again and see you soon.
Thank you, Pradesh. It was absolutely a pleasure. As I said, sometimes a small audience results in a good conversation. I'm so glad that I talked to all of you again. I hope to continue the conversation. So I really look forward to it in Nepal.